is minus 30 degrees. The wind has been coming off the ice sheet for 3 days, and it does not stop at night. There is no house with heating. There is no coat you bought in a shop. There is no shop. There is no guarantee that you will see the season after this one. For most of the last 100,000 years, this was Europe. So how did anybody get through a single winter, let alone thousands of them? Start with how bad it actually was. Around 26,000 years ago, the planet hit the coldest stretch of the last ice age, a period researchers call the Last Glacial Maximum. Ice sheets up to 3 kilometers thick sat on top of Scandinavia and most of Canada. So much water was locked into that ice that global sea level was roughly 120 meters lower than it is today. Britain was not an island. You could walk to it. And across the north of Eurasia, from Spain all the way to Siberia, stretched a landscape that no longer exists anywhere on Earth. It is usually called the mammoth steppe. Cold, dry, wind-scoured grassland with almost no trees and enormous animals grazing across it. Mammoth, woolly rhino, horse, bison, reindeer. It was not empty. It was full of food that could also kill you. And people live there, all year round. The first thing to understand is that the body on its own is nowhere near enough. A naked human being starts losing the fight somewhere below 25 degrees Celsius of still air. We are a tropical animal. No fur, sweat glands everywhere, built for heat we can walk away from. Neanderthals did about the best a body can do. Shorter limbs, a wider ribcage, heavier bones, and a large nasal cavity that warmed and moistened freezing air before it hit the lungs. It is the same rule you see in Arctic animals. Keep the bulk in the middle, keep the extremities short, and give the cold as little surface as possible. And it still is not enough. Because a cold-adapted body buys you a few degrees. Winter on a mammoth steppe was asking for 30 or 40. Everything that closed that gap had to be made, not grown. The obvious first answer is fire. And fire is genuinely ancient. There's burnt bone and ash at Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, going back something like 1 million years. By 400,000 years ago, hearths across Europe and the Middle East are routine. Not a lucky lightning strike kept alive, but fire made deliberately in the same spot over and over. But there's a problem with fire in the Ice Age that nobody mentions. On the mammoth steppe, there were barely any trees. So what exactly are you burning every single night for 6 months? At Kostenki in western Russia, archaeologists found the answer sitting in the hearths. Bone. A team led by Alexander Pryor showed that people there were burning mammoth bone as fuel around 25,000 years ago. Bone from a fat-rich animal does burn. It needs a little wood to get going, and then it holds a slow, hot, long fire. A mammoth is not just dinner. A mammoth is also the woodpile. Which brings us to the strangest houses ever built. At Mezhyrek in Ukraine, around 15,000 years ago, people built circular huts out of mammoth bone. Not a few bones. One of those huts used the jawbones of roughly 150 mammoths, stacked in an interlocking herringbone pattern to make the wall. Tusks arched over the top as a frame. Hides went over that. A hearth burned in the middle. At Kostenki, Pryor's team excavated a bone circle 12.5 meters across. Think about the labor in that. Then think about the planning. Nobody assembles a house out of 150 mammoth jaws in a panic in November. That is a structure you build because you already know exactly what December is going to do to you. But the single most important cold technology your ancestors ever invented is smaller than your little finger. It is a needle. Specifically an eye needle, a sliver of bone or ivory, ground thin, polished smooth, with a hole drilled through one end. The oldest one we have comes from Denisova Cave in Siberia, and it is roughly 50,000 years old. That hole changes everything. Because there's an enormous difference between draping a hide over your shoulders and wearing clothing. A draped hide flaps. Wind gets underneath it. It is a blanket you have to hold on to. A sewn garment traps a layer of still air against your skin and keeps it there while you walk, hunt, climb, and carry. Still air is the actual insulation, for is simply a way of holding still air in place. Tailored, layered clothing, an inner layer, an outer fur layer, a hood, mittens, and footwear is worth something like 4 to 5 CLO of insulation. In plain terms, that is the difference between surviving at 0 and surviving at -40. Gilligan, an archaeologist who works on prehistoric clothing, argues this was never a comfort upgrade. It was the entry ticket. Without fitted clothing, most of the northern half of Eurasia is simply closed to human beings. And there's a wonderfully strange way to put a date on it. Human head lice live in your hair. Human body lice live in your clothing and only crawl onto the skin to feed. Body lice cannot exist without clothes. Clothing is their entire habitat. So geneticists, among them Ralph Kittler and Mark Kostenki, sequenced both kinds and asked when the two lineages split. The answer came back at very roughly 70,000 years ago, with a wide margin of error on either side. Somewhere around then, people started wearing clothing consistently enough that a parasite evolved to live in it full-time. Your ancestors' laundry problem turns out to be a scientific instrument. And we can actually see what those clothes looked like. At Sungir, near Vladimir in Russia, about 34,000 years ago, several people were buried with astonishing care. Their bodies were covered in thousands of beads carved from mammoth ivory. The beads were not in a heap. They lay in lines and rows because they had been sewn onto the clothing the bodies were wearing. So when archaeologists mapped exactly where every bead had fallen, the clothing reappeared. A pullover shirt with no front opening, a hood, long trousers, footwear joined directly to the trousers, like a modern one-piece snowsuit. Each ivory bead takes something in the region of an hour to make. There are thousands of them, including on children. These are not people huddling and hoping. These are people with a tailoring tradition. And at Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, around 26,000 years ago, Olga Sofer identified impressions of woven textile pressed into fired clay. Cordage, netting, basketry, 26,000 years ago. Somebody was making string. And once you have string, you have nets, bags, snares, and seams. Now the part that actually kills people. Food. In winter on the steppe, nothing is growing. No fruit, no greens, no roots you can dig out ground frozen solid. You are eating animals, and animals in late winter are lean. And here is the trap. You cannot live on lean meat. If protein climbs above roughly a third of your calories, your liver cannot keep up with processing it, and you weaken and sicken while eating constantly. Arctic explorers called it rabbit starvation. You starve with a full stomach. So what you're really hunting is not meat. It is fat. That is why marrow bones get cracked open. That is why skulls get open for the brain. That is why spongy bone gets smashed, boiled for hours, and skimmed to render out the grease. In 2025, researchers working at Neumark-Nord in Germany described a site where Neanderthals had hauled bones from dozens of large animals to one spot beside the water and systematically processed them for exactly this. 125,000 years ago, there was a place whose entire purpose was manufacturing fat. And you do not eat any of it in the month you catch it. Winter is not survived in winter. Across the far north, the same pattern appears again and again. Kill in autumn, when the animals are fattest and the herds are on the move. Then store. Dig a pit in a ground that stays frozen a meter down, fill it with meat, and cap it. You have just built a freezer. Dry it in the wind. Smoke it over the hearth. Pack it in rendered fat. And then you have to do the hardest thing of all, which is not touch it. In October, sitting beside more food than you can possibly eat, you have to leave most of it alone for a February you have never met. That is not a physical adaptation. That is a mind running a simulation of a person who does not exist yet. And none of it works alone. One person cannot hunt a mammoth, render its fat, tan its hide, sew the garments, cut the bone, raise the hut, and keep the fire alive. A hearth inside a bone hut at Mesirich is not only heat. It is the reason everybody is in the same room for 6 months, talking. An enormous amount of human culture was probably made in winter, for the simple reason that winter is when there is nowhere else to be. Which leads to the uncomfortable part. The Neanderthals had the cold-adapted body. They had fire. They had hides and scrapers and 400,000 years of experience in Europe. What we have not found at Neanderthal sites is the eyed needle. Plenty of awls, which punch holes. Very little sign of true sewing. This is an argument rather than a settled fact, and absence of evidence is a genuinely weak kind of evidence. But it lines up with something uncomfortable. The population that came through the deepest cold is the one carrying a splinter of bone with a hole in it. Not the stronger body, the better seam. So the answer to how ancient humans survive winter is not one thing. It is fire made from the animal you ate. It is a house built from the animal you ate. It is a coat sewn from the hide of the animal you ate, with a needle cut from its bone and thread pulled from its sinew. And it is a pit of food you buried in autumn for a person you had not become yet. None of that is instinct. Every part of it has to be taught, remembered, and handed on before the cold arrives. Winter did not select for the toughest human beings. It selected for the ones who planned in August, and the ones who were taught by somebody who had already survived it. Tonight, you'll turn a dial on a wall. Somebody 40,000 years ago sat up in the dark and fed a bone into a fire so that you eventually could.